We have with us today Wes Crenshaw to help us navigate this minefield. Wes is a Kansas City metro psychologist and author of I Always Want to Be Where I'm Not, Successful Living with ADD and ADHD. His newest book, Consent-Based Sex, will be out this fall or winter. Wes will talk about the challenges of intimacy, sexual and emotional, for teens and young adults, and he will address the role that parents may be able to play in all of this. Then he'll take your questions. If you want to ask a question, type it in the Ask the Question box. So Wes, I turn it over to you. Hope you can give us some pointers on this tough topic.
I can give so many pointers that we could be here for 5 or 6 hours. So the only problem we're having is technically I lost control of the slides. So if you just want to go ahead and advance them for me, we can. You can move to the title slide. For some reason, it is not responding to me. And as I hope the listeners will respond to me well. So I recently began to realize I've worked with teenagers for many, many years, since really the start of my career way back in 1994. And over the course of that time, from very early on, and increasingly so in recent years, I've realized that if you are going to talk to teenagers about anything, you have to be able to talk to them about sexuality. That is true for all teenagers, because really kind of the point of adolescence for teens is organizing your sexuality. And I've believed that for the duration of my career. That has become infinitely more true in the last 5 to 10 years. And at this point, young people's generations aren't really literal generations. They are like 4-year generations. Like every high school 4 years turns over and changes. People who want to learn a lot more about this, I'll be referencing some of our other materials that are on my website, which is drwest.com. It's dr-west.com. And we'll have up there in the next couple of days a radio and TV program we did in the last couple of weeks. And we talked a lot about these issues, but one of the things that came out most prominently was I had a senior in high school, recent graduate of high school, who is bisexual, and she was saying that for the freshmen in her high school, it's a flagship urban high school here in the suburbs of Kansas City, for the freshmen in her school, it is completely different to be GBLT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, than it is for the seniors. That the freshmen are the more open and involved in these more open sexual identities. And that's just a 4-year difference, and that's what we're seeing. So it really behooves parents of any teenagers to be on top of these issues. As Wayne alluded, and we'll go ahead and advance the slide, as Wayne alluded, it is more true for kids with ADHD because they have a couple of issues that are very relevant that we'll talk about as we move through it. One of them is, of course, impulsivity. And where sex is fun when you take it responsibly, that's somewhat the antithesis of having impulsive, immediate responses. And what we know in sexuality, both in the protection of and enjoyment of sexuality, is impulsivity is the enemy of good judgment. That's one issue. The other issue is that for many kids, and I've seen, I always say I had about 24,000 hours of clinical contact at this point in my career. For kids with ADD, there is an issue of connectedness, of emotional connectedness that goes to some problems of empathy. Now, maybe you have kids that don't have this problem. I certainly know some. But on average, kids with ADD, because empathy means having a high degree of focus on someone's feelings and being able to respond congruently to those, they have a hard time with that. So you actually have to teach kids to be able to show empathy whether they feel it or not. That critical issue in dating, sexuality, falling in love, forming a partnership, makes it more difficult. So there's a couple of issues that have to do specifically with the ADD teens. If some of you have kids that are on the autism spectrum, which sometimes coexists with ADD, you will also recognize those issues as present. So for teens and young adults, and really, as we say here, anybody, the point of sex really needs to be to act intentionally. Our book is called, this fall will be coming out, it's called Consent-Based Sex Education, and we believe that the core of any sexual involvement has to be the idea not only of consent, meaning yes means yes or no means no, but an internal consent, a sense that you are emotionally choosing to do what you mean to do. And in this case, we believe that you have to think with your head, not any of the other parts of your body, as the old saying goes. I actually, if you get on our website, you'll see I did a TV segment this Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is always a big time for us in the media because we do so much about love and sexuality. And I made these little chocolate brains in molds, and I brought them on the TV set. And I said that we needed to give out chocolate brains at Valentine's Day instead of hearts because there were enough hearts involved in Valentine's Day to get us all in trouble. That's what we're trying to do in teaching kids to think with their heads. And I think I have the molds for those chocolate brains. If you want to have a cool Valentine's gift next year, do that. Or you can use them at Halloween for zombies, I guess. The kids are most likely now to be dealing with a broader range of issues, and we can go ahead and advance the slides. We have both the old school issues and the new age issues or new culture issues. So the sort of old school ones have to do with, you know, what you learned in health class. The body and how it works. Birth control is critically important. If you're not having a conversation with teenagers about birth control, you are putting them at substantial risk. One of the reasons, the primary reason that the birth rate has gone down is because teenage girls have mastered birth control. And I at one time had 4 pregnant teenage girls on my caseload back in 1997, and I made a vow then that I would do everything I could, including now having a health certificate in sex education and sex therapy, to really reduce that. Well, that was a national movement, not just in my office, but everywhere, and that has really helped. So in your personal movement, be sure that's a discussion you're having early on. STIs, we'll talk a little bit about that, sexually transmitted infections. This is, the ADD kids have a particularly difficult time with this because they will, a girl or a guy will think they are protected by whatever safe sex practice they're using and then not use it consistently. Consistency is a problem. Or they will use it inadequately. There's a term for birth control called perfect use and average use. And those are 2 different statistics on the effectiveness of preventing pregnancy. It's absolutely true with STIs also. Perfect use, let's just say, is not one of the things kids with ADD are good at. And that has to do with condom use, with taking the pill in terms of pregnancy. With any practice that prevents those things, perfect use tends to be a problem. And then finally, the decision about when to have sex. We have to understand statistically, and it's interesting, people either are shocked at this or they are like, oh yeah, wow. 95% of all adults alive today state that they had sex prior to or outside of marriage. The idea that waiting until you're married is actually a thing just isn't true. And so the small number who do cite that do so because they have a very strict, typically a very strict religious code, and that is perfectly fine. If that is a belief system that's important to you and your child, by all means pursue that. But the vast, vast majority of people will not be using that as their decision model. And so helping kids have a solid decision model is very critical. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. And when we really look back in history, a lot of those issues are just not new. in this, or a lot of the issues in the new culture aren't really that new. They're just more at the forefront. We're really able to talk about them more. And people have kind of two reactions to this. One is, oh my gosh, there's too much talk about sex. I have a different view of this. Talking to teenagers 5 days a week and their parents a part of that time, my view is that all of this communication about sex is actually pretty good. Kids are having some of the most sophisticated discussions with each other about sex I've ever seen in my life. Now, that's not fixing all our problems, but it is giving us a platform to really help guide them in those decisions. So a shocking example that I think sounds bad on the surface, but you think about it a little more, is this. It is common, almost normal, for a guy to say to a girl something that equates to, are you a sexual person? Now, from a sex education standpoint, we're all sexual people, so it's kind of a silly question, but you know what they mean. Will you have sex with me? And this is after they've known each other for, 10 minutes. That sounds kind of horrible, and initially I was sort of bothered by that. What is doing, and this happens on Tinder, the dating app, it happens online, it happens at a party, it happens anywhere. What's good about that is that's the first question of consent. That is the ability for people to choose and to say, no, I don't really do that until we've dated 3 times or something. So if you can work with kids to have an answer to those questions and to think through the answer, that is a great thing to do. So let's move on to the next slide. And these are some of the issues kids are talking about. I already mentioned consent as the core element of the decision to have sex. We believed this before it became cool recently. You're hearing about consent all the time. Last week on This American Life, you can get the podcast from NPR. There is a podcast called The Birds and the Bees. I highly recommend it. We're going to cite it in the book. We're going to have some quotes. We're actually filling out the forms to use it today. It is such a good discussion of consent at the college level and how difficult and complex it is. But again, we see consent as being broader than that. It has to do with you choosing what you're choosing to do. Now, one of the things that's hard about that for parents, and I cannot tell you how much more true this is for ADD kids than everyone else, because they're having to be intentional in every behavior. One of the things that's hard for parents is if you accept the idea that having sex is a choice, it is a decision, then you have to accept that the choice could be yes. And too often in our history, sex education has been how to convince kids to say no. I suppose I don't need to tell you how well that has turned out. By the age of 20, the vast majority of kids, by a factor of about 75% at least, depending on what statistic you look at, have had sex. So telling people don't have sex absolutely is not giving anyone the education they need to make those choices. So when you accept that this is a choice, then you have to accept that the choice could be yes. And your goal by allowing and encouraging authentic choice is to help the decision to be a wise one. Now, as a therapist, I do this a lot because this is an issue kids bring in. As a parent, you can do it too. You have to start earlier because you have to build a culture with the child where that conversation can be okay. Now, again, as we attach this to the ADD crowd, decision-making, as you deal with it every day in your home, and you decide, or am I going to wear the right clothes today? Am I going to take a shower? Am I going to, make a new friend? Am I going to do my homework? Am I going to remember my backpack? All of these choices, and we have to teach kids to be intentional, to think, what am I doing right now? The same holds true with sex. And if you don't want to think about that, you're putting your kid at the same risk of making a bad decision about sex as they would be about driving or doing homework or flunking out of school or any of the issues we see more immediately or think about. You have to talk to kids about the core principles of coupling and love. And this is different today. The idea of dating has diminished tremendously as young people are more prone to hook up. which has broad meaning. You never know what it means when somebody says we hooked up unless you kind of ask them, to really to these more, we have some cases where there's just these very, very serious, almost marital relationships that are kind of a reaction to that, what's called hookup culture. You get that whole broad array. And let me be perfectly clear, if you believe that sexual culture for teens is like what we call masculocentric, that it's male, the males are setting the agenda for that, that simply is not true. There are plenty of girls who are very willing to be engaged in casual sex, and they are from a fairly young age. And there are different reasons why different girls are willing to do that, but it is the default response at this point. That's the question, are you a sexual person? Or if they're a little younger, they'll say, are you prude? Which means, are you prudish? Which is a kind of a blunt, not very nice way to put that. But that question comes up earlier than you would ever imagine. Very prominently now, sexual and gender identity, and this goes beyond what we can really hit in this seminar. We did a great show on it a couple weeks ago, and then 2 years ago on our public radio show. Did really good material on that. If you're not following issues of sexual and gender identity right now, you're not going to be prepared to deal with them with kids. And one of the things we always suggest with kids, whether they're ADD or not, is that you as a parent prepare yourself. We're going to talk later about our plus model for that. But you have to think ahead. And for many years, people have said, well, what would I do if my daughter got pregnant? You sort of think about that as she gets older, and you think, wow, that could be a normal possibility. That's great. Be sure you prepare yourself for that. But you also have to prepare yourself for a child who might be gay or transgender. One of the reasons why is because the research tells us that for kids who are transgender, there is a higher rate of Asperger's and probably ADD. Now, we're not all sure that we understand quite why that is. It may just be that historically you've had to be different to want to be gay or transgender, but now that's much less of a need. So we're seeing people who are outside of those diagnoses much more broadly presenting as gay or lesbian or transgender. So, but if you have a kid who's ADD, their ability to kind of, that thing we always say about them thinking outside the box and being creative and different and artistic, those are the things that make it easier to then also identify and say, I want to be out of the sex and sexual identity box, or out of the gender identity box. So one has to really be thinking, how do I support my child if that disclosure comes out? And we'll again talk about the plus model later to help with that. I talked a little already about the casual versus couple-based sex. Then we have our, I got to tell you, the #1 sex educator in America is not the public schools. We've recently in Kansas had this big debate about, what kind of words and language and posters should you have in the middle school about sex education. And I think our politicians really think that matters. And it doesn't, because the #1 sex educator in America today is online pornography. We have a whole chapter in our book about this. And in fact, my co-author, Kyra Haas, is working on it right now. She's doing additional statistical research on it. And what we're finding is a lot of the research underestimates its significance, because teenagers aren't very willing to respond. Yeah, I watch porn 6 hours a week. They aren't willing to say that to researchers, yet we know clinically, ask any teenage girl, there's a term for this, and it's for boys who are sexual in a certain way, and it's called porn educated. And this has numerous ramifications. As you are well aware, kids who have ADD are particularly interested in visual imagery. They love video games. They love to be interactive with those things. They'll sit in front of computers for hours. I believe they are highly prone, in my experience, to become extra interested in pornographic imagery. And it is so prevalent now. It is so easy to look at things that are astonishingly explicit. It takes about 3 or 4 mouse clicks. So this is where kids are getting their information. I outline in our article, or in our chapter, why this is problematic for teenagers. You may think you know, but it's more complicated than it appears. Because on one hand, kids are gaining a lot of information from this. On the other hand, it is information that often has not only no consent attached, but it actually is kind of degrading and destructive. So you have to be able, and I know this is immense amounts of fun for parents, you have to be able to carry on an intelligent conversation about what constitutes appropriate visual sexual behavior and inappropriate visual behavior. And that is about as complicated as I made it sound. But we're going to actually have scripts in the books. The book is going to have a script for you to kind of take in and modify for how to have this conversation. Sexuality and social media. When the internet really blew up in the early part of the last decade, people were all scared to death that there were all these pervs out there in cyberspace that were going to reach down the Cat 5 cable and pull their kids into a life of sexual misconduct. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, thankfully, came out about the first year this was a big deal and said that is not the problem. The problem is what kids put on the internet and how they interact with each other. That's absolutely true. It remains so to this day. Kids are much more at risk of posting or trading or sending their own sexually explicit material to each other, and a big percentage of them do it, not just verbally, but in pictures, than they are of being trafficked over the internet. So we have to really understand how they are involved in that process. There are kids, there are boys, particularly more boys than girls, who trade sexually explicit pictures of girls they know, like trading cards. This is a fairly well-known problem. And finally, teaching ethical sexual conduct. That isn't going to show up in your health class. You as the parent have to do that. And as we know with the kids with ADD, and I got 2 of them at home, you have to really go through a decisional model of how do I treat others in a way that enhances my character and theirs. And this has to be a conversation you have from day one. I always tell people the place we started learning about consent was with the cats. I have an office cat, and I have 3 cats at home. And when the kids would pick up the cats, and the cats didn't want to be picked up, and the cats would cry out, we have nice cats, so they didn't like bite their nose or anything, but the cats would cry out, and we would say the cat is saying no. The cat is not giving you consent. The cats have free will. We would say those words, and they would have to put the cats down. Our poor cats have been more a part of that teaching model over the years than you can probably the SPCA would allow. But that was the first lesson, and we continue that forward as they grow up. The other one that always comes up on consent is you have grandma who comes in, and I've had to talk to my mom about it, and she hugs and kisses the kids and grabs them and squeezes them, and the kids are like, no, grandma, no. And, you know, if you're going to tell them you can't do that to the cat, you have to tell grandma no, that the kids are saying no, because the kids no has to count for something. And even if it's grandma, and we all know grandma didn't mean anything by it, she's just being grandma. But that's part of consent. Who touches us and how they touch us that's the lesson to learn. Okay, let's go ahead and advance the next slide. A good sex education for kids is always the mindful one. And this is especially true with the ADD kids. And I'm going to give you 3 points to think about how to help them make better decisions. So the first one, you can advance the slide. The first one is health, and this one is the obvious one. Scaring kids, I promise you I've tried. Scaring kids with creepy STIs will not prevent them from having sex unless they are horribly anxious. And honestly, folks, if you have anxious kids, you will sometimes have the combination of ADD and anxiety. I treat that a lot. If you have anxious kids, it's not nice to scare them with things like this. It will give them sexual issues down the road. I treat those cases. Please think that the goal is to teach kids to have a healthy, positive relationship with sexuality. And if what you're doing is scaring the anxious kids to death, that's going to hurt them down the road, I promise you. So likewise, it isn't effective because when they're really highly hormonal, they override their better judgment. This is especially true with the ADD kids who have, the ones who have no anxiety. No matter how much you scare them, they're not going to listen to that anyhow. And they will actually have a backlash against you on that. So scaring is not the case. What's tricky, though, is that you have to be able to convey that message in a way that they still have free will. So you basically have to tell somebody, if you would, I know this sounds ridiculous, but you didn't say it literally this way. You're basically saying if you really want to go out and have a lot of random hookups, just be aware you will get something, and here is how you will have to treat it. And some of those things you can't get rid of, so you're going to need to know about Valtrex, and you talk about Valtrex is what suppresses herpes. And you talk about that. And as you're just kind of telling them, this will be what you need to know in the future, and you'll take Valtrex every day, and when you get big sores on your genitals, that probably you don't want to have sex with other people. You see the difference in the conversation? I'm telling them, I understand you have the freedom to go get herpes, and so let's plan ahead for that. Well, then they take you more seriously, because you're not only projecting them into a plausible reality, and believe me, herpes is very common, but you're also saying, here's how you will work on the problem. You can't ever get rid of it, but you will treat it this way. That actually works better because you're not making it sound like you're stopping them. I will even say to kids, I'm not trying to stop you from having sex with a different partner every day of the week. That's not my decision, but let's plan ahead for the outcome. And that will give a little more pause, but you notice I'm still saying this is a free decision. It's a free choice. This is hard for parents because you don't want to believe your kid has that choice. And yet, especially if you have an ADD one, the impulsivity gives them that choice, and sometimes it's not a wise one. So, next slide. Oh, yeah, this is kind of important. I try very hard to get kids to be tested between partners. I cannot tell you how difficult this is because, again, impulsivity makes them not want to go get tested 20 times a year. And that's not an uncommon number for particularly college kids. But trying to help them understand this sort of little line, I say random hookups are a lot more fun than facing the consequences. That's kind of the point I was making earlier about giving them the free choice. Next slide. So as I was saying earlier, on average, not everybody, but on average, the kids with ADD, even as young adults, have a harder time with actual emotional intimacy. And they will look instead at sex like this sort of, wilderness adventure, ropes course or something that's really exciting, and not so much as a way to express sentiment or spiritual connection. You might think, well, that's probably boys he's talking about. I absolutely have girls who have it the same way. In fact, I have about an 80-20 split. Girls to guys. I see about 80% girls, and I have plenty of them who have a very difficult time with the ADD, like having that connection to another person. That makes it a lot harder to deal with the heart issues that you're trying to teach kids. Next slide. So what I try to do, and I've been at this long enough that I see kids now, kids I saw when they were 13 years old are 30 now. So I've gotten a pretty good longitudinal analysis of this. And if you can kind of help them have this idea, and I will admit this one does work better with girls. this idea that what's super fun now may not look so good after you're 25, and you start to look back on yourself at 20 and not like what you see. I have some very kind of brutal examples. Many of you with ADD kids know that sometimes you have to like raise their anxiety a certain level when they don't have any to begin with. And I have a number of examples where I've really had to put it down to kids. What you're doing now, you're going to look back when you're 25 and you're going to see it as having raped yourself. And that has worked several times to have when kids will come back in and said, I never thought of it that way before. This is a very tough road because kids will not, they're not built at 18 or 17 to think about future and consequence. So you're actually creating a reality that they have to think about. Now, I'll admit that works better when they're about 20, 21, but it's still an uphill climb because especially with ADD, consequence is not the thing you think about first. And I always try to say, you know, will you be looking back on this with pride or regret? Now, I would never utter that you're going to look back at this like raping yourself to somebody who was choosing the sexual path that they were on. Where that applies is for people who drink a lot and have multiple partners, 20, 30 partners by the time they're 21. And they do come out of this very indistinguishable from victims of actual sexual assault. They have much of the same trauma. So trying to help them understand that without just doing that scare thing is really tricky. But that is a goal you can have, and you have to be the kind communicator as a parent when you're talking about that. Next slide. The third aspect that we try to teach kids, again, is ethics. And although we should all expect others, or we should expect everyone to act with integrity in their sexual expression, the folks with ADD have to be especially mindful in treating both themselves and their partners with both moral and psychological integrity. And, you know, in addition, I mean, I always say that errant reproduction is itself an unethical act because you're pulling in a third party, a baby, into your chaos. And if you're not prepared for that, you're just making someone else endure your chaos. And I will say that to kids when they're reluctant to do birth control. I should insert here the best example of this. The only time in the last 20 years I've had problems with getting kids to follow, girls to follow a birth control regimen is there is a subset of girls, all of them that I've ever seen have ADD, whose goal it is at 16 is to get pregnant. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding about that. People will tend to see that as, you know, if they have a baby, it'll love them and they want to be loved. Maybe, but what's more important is they believe to a person, whether they admit it or not, that if they have the baby, this will free them from having to grow up and take on the obligations of adulthood. Now, I understand that's the craziest thing you've ever heard. But if you think about it, it actually, there's some sense to it. That if you have a baby at 16, no matter what the parents say, and you can all tell your kid, I'm not taking care of that baby. The minute that baby shows up, everybody melts and they take care of the baby. And the child, the 16-year-old child with the baby. And girls have seen this in their surroundings, and they see how everybody changes and they become super tolerant of the young mom and allow her a lot of latitude, like not having to go to college or not having to get a job or whatever. And parents will give many more years of support to a child with a baby. We have had to actually set up situations where young people are not allowed out of the house, and I am not a controlling therapist, but we have had to set it up where kids are not allowed out of the house unless they will be on an industrial-grade birth control, like Depo-Provera that's a shot, or the Nexplanon that goes in their arm, because we know that this is their goal. And if you can just get them to 18 or 19, it's at least enough better that they will manage better. And so this is the one very severe ethical violation that happens in these cases that is very unique to ADD. If you see a kid, it's hard to pick them up sometimes because they won't just admit it up front. But when you see somebody who is sexually active and refusing birth control, you should assume that is the problem. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit here about the plus model. If you don't deal with sexuality with your teenager at some point before they're 19, you must be asleep or something, because this is the critical element of adolescence. No matter what problem kids come in to talk with me about, it always connects back to some area of sexuality and relationship building. And with the ADD kids, it's doubly important to deal with this because, again, it's got to be mindful. You've got to build that sense of intentionality. So we're going to talk about, we have the plus model, P-L-U-S. You can advance to the next slide. And I'm toying with the idea of turning pause into prepare. This may be the P plus model before we get it done, P-P-L-U-S. But we already talked about preparing, you know, drive in the car and walk yourself, you know, on the way to work and talk yourself through the model and how would I respond in this situation, how would I respond in that. And the first thing you do is pause. And so if you discover, you know, one of the common ones nowadays is you discover the child using pornography or producing pornography and sending it to a friend or whatever. The first thing you have to teach yourself to do is pause. And the less you say in that moment, the less you'll have to take back. And again, as I work with adults too, and with some with ADD, some without, sexual trauma comes from having these encounters where they're caught masturbating, or they're caught with pornography, or they're caught sending nude photos or something foolish, and they're shamed. And there's just not a good reason to do this. I'm all in my book, I Always Want to Be Where I'm Not, which is my book about ADHD. I talk about the difference between functional shame, which is feeling bad for a wrong you've committed, and toxic shame, which is just feeling like you're a bad person. And so if your child violates someone's consent, has sex with them without full consent, okay, that's a good reason to feel ashamed that you've done something to harm somebody. But if you get caught looking at pornography, that's time for a discussion about what's positive or negative about pornography, how it can be hurtful, why it teaches things that are not accurate about sexuality. It's not a time to say that's just filthy, you know, you're just a bad child for this, or communicating that in any way. And if you're not preparing yourself ahead of time for the pause, that may be your reaction. And so you want to think, how do I want to respond to this scenario? When, you know, catching somebody with a dating partner in bed with them in the middle of the night. Boy, if I had $1 for every time that one's come through this door, I would buy pizza for everybody on the webinar today. It is such a commonality, and you have to, you know, it's uncomfortable, but you have to think, how am I going to handle this when it happens? Okay, next slide. The second thing you have to do after the pause is to listen. And one of the biggest mistakes you'll run into in any conflict is formulating your opinion before you've really heard the person's other side of it. And I got to say, I learned how to parent from my dad, and he was a master at this plus model, even though he's been dead since 1990, and I invented it long after his death. I learned it from him, and he would sit and just listen and talk with me about sneaking out of the house or whatever stupid thing I was doing at the moment. I got caught doing that one time. I remember it like it was yesterday. And he, you know, what drew you to doing this, and, you know, why did you think this was the right thing to do? And really getting me to talk about it. I remember it so well because of how he handled it. And I'm not going to tell you I never snuck out of the house again, but boy, I understood why the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of the behavior. So be listening, and then moving on to the next slide, be understanding. And I mean this in a very specific way. I don't mean you say to the child, you know, I really understand why you snuck out of the house or your boyfriend is in here. I get it now. That's great. Why don't you guys go back to what you're doing? That is not what I'm saying, because the point of being a teenager is to be a teenager, and the point of being a parent is to parent. And you have to separate those two things. You don't have to condone things that you think are problematic. But first, you have to really understand not only what is happening, like why is the person engaged in whatever they're engaged in or what's important to them about it, but you have to understand what your reaction is. If your first reaction is to say, this, what you're watching is filthy and you're just dirty that you're doing this, before you utter that, you need to think about, what is my value for that? Why am I feeling so bothered by this? Is it because I want my child not to have problematic sexual messages from pornography? Or is it something about me? Did I have a bad experience with this, or someone mistreated me because they watched too much pornography, or I caught a parent looking at pornography when I was 13 and it made me uncomfortable? What is your connection to this? And you want to ask yourself that. The most common one, or that's not true, but one of the very common ones right now is to have a child disclose that they are gay or bisexual or trans. And I got to tell you, I'm kind of amazed nowadays at how many parents do a good job with this. We tend to associate it with a big problem, but I'm seeing more and more parents, as culture changes, being able to sit down and think this through. But in some cases, especially I'm 52, and parents in my age range have a little harder time, and they associate being gay with something very like a death. This used to be the thing. Therapists would say, oh, you have to grieve this like a death in the family. That's not a good metaphor. That hurts the child's feelings deeply. I'm not dead, the child says. So we now understand that isn't the way to approach that. And if you're thinking of it in yourself, if your reaction is, oh, this is just like my child, it's not my child anymore, they're just like a totally new person, that's your trigger, that's your reaction. So not only understanding the child, but your response and how those two things go together. And finally, we will move on to the next slide. S stands for being sex positive. It's very interesting to me that we are of a generation that grew up in the sexual revolution. Parents who have teenagers are either, and I'm an older parent, so I have an 18-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I'm 52. So people are either in my age or a tiny bit older, or they're a little younger. All of us either grew up in the sexual revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, or we are products of it. We're younger than that, and it already had happened. And so people will ask me in interviews, what's wrong with us? Why are we still so hung up? And I think the answer is because we were taught sex is dirty, but it's okay to be dirty. Like, you know, it's all right, just be dirty. That's not really a very good position to take. It's better for us to think that if it weren't for sex, we'd all be in big trouble because we wouldn't exist. And that sex is inherently a good thing, but how you consume it, how you engage in it, it's only fun, it's only a good thing if you are responsible with it, if you are ethical, if you are treating others with consent and yourself. And so being sex positive to me means, are you doing what you meant to do? Are you being intentional? Now, again, as I said earlier, that means if you have a child who is making a decision about sex, you're going to have to let that be their choice. You can advise them. If the child has ADD, you can say, are you sure you're not jumping into something here that you are not prepared for, like you would any other impulsive decision? But if you come across instead with a very high level of judgment or shaming or having a negative response, and it's so easy to do, you can utter one sentence and realize, uh-oh, that didn't come across well. Then you're going to create more distance between you and the child, and potentially sexual trauma for them. And go ahead and advance to the next slide. It also, sex positive also means that consent is core, and we're only now as a society beginning to realize this. We think we were a little ahead of the game. When you work with teenagers and young adults, one of the advantages is that you're always ahead of the game because they're on the cutting edge. And so we saw this coming a couple of years ago. And this idea that we need to start with the consent being the main point of sexuality and education is becoming very prominent nowadays. Getting it done, if you listen to that episode of This American Life, you will see how hard it is to do. But part of why it's hard is because they're starting when the kids are in college. And we need to have this conversation when they're hugging the cats. And finally, one more slide. Again, consent means a lot more than no means no, and it's more than yes means yes. There's a new thing called enthusiastic consent, which is great. This idea that you're very clearly wanting to do this. There's not reluctance in there. But we think you go beyond that, because to have enthusiastic consent, you have to have emotional consent. This is, again, for the ADD crowd, not being self-reflective isn't their best thing. And so helping them have an internal life and helping them think, is this what I mean to do in every aspect of life, critically important, and nowhere more so than where sexuality is concerned. And then we go to the next slide. I've kind of already made this point, but I'm going to summarize or sum it up by saying consent means authentic choice. There is a funny T-shirt out there that it's actually, it's funny, but it's also really smart. And I think it's something like, if you Google feminist rules for dating my daughter, you'll find it. And, you know, there's this other, like, traditional T-shirt that's like all these sort of, I'm going to shoot you if you date my daughter or something. You know, it's kind of ridiculous. But the feminist version of this says, rules for dating my daughter, you don't make the rules. I don't make the rules. She makes the rules. And that is a great way to teach both your daughter and your son how consent operates. You think, what do I mean to do here? And then you choose and hold yourself out accurately to others. This is my line. And a lot of the work I do with kids, particularly the ADD kids who struggle with that, you know, that response set, is, what do you want to do? What do you mean to do? And they say, well, you know, I don't know. I think I'll just see what happens. No. No. If this happens, what are you going to do? Well, I think I'll do that. Okay, what if this happens? Well, I'm not going to do that. Okay, giving them the sense of decision-making and therefore self-efficacy to actually follow through in those situations when the hormones are raging and the lights are down and maybe somebody's drunk a little bit. That's when it comes down to the real authentic choice that only they can make, and helping them learn to do it will get you a lot further than just say no. So I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, good. That was totally enlightening, Wes, I have to say. Several questions about pornography. One specifically...
I bet.
I caught my child on his tablet when he wasn't supposed to be and watching pornographic sites. How do I make sure that he doesn't think he's a bad person? We talked afterwards about why I dislike porn, but I don't want him to feel shamed.
Well, that's such a good question. Okay, so let me talk really quickly about filtering first. I think it's just fine to filter. The one we use for iPhones and iPads is called MobiCip, M-O-B-I-C-I-P. And it'll explain itself to you. It's real easy to use, and it has a web-based interface. And it's great. Now, why do I think it's good to filter? Well, until a person is 18, they are a minor, and you have the right to decide on the content. There is a 0% chance that is going to limit their ultimate access to explicit material. But the message you want to send and the conversation you want to have has to be, I do not approve of this material on the machines we purchase for you. Okay, so that's part one. Nothing wrong with that. Now, that said, I think you come back and you say, I know that you will ultimately be seeing this material because it's everywhere in our world. And in the chapter, in the book, we will go through in explicit detail, believe me, and say the conversations you need to have. The big one is, again, consent. You convey to the child, when you look at material, erotic material, be thinking, are these people really agreeing to do this? Are they enjoying it? Or is this really something that's kind of negative, like it's hurting them or it's being made to hurt them? There is an enormous amount of pornography that is built specifically to look hurtful and degrading. And I don't just mean in the kinky world. I mean, like, I think it is basically men hating women. If you ever read that book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, when that book came out in Scandinavia, that's not what it was called. The title of the book is Men Who Hate Women. And I think that pornography currently is representing a lot of hate towards women. So I would talk to the son and say, does this, whatever you see out there, does it look like both parties are really into it? Are they really having a positive experience? And I personally, and I admit this is my kind of 52-year-old man bias, I prefer for kids to see material that is couples based. I don't care what their sexual orientation is, that looks like people are a couple, that they are really actually engaged in a loving relationship. I think you can throw that in there. And again, you can say, I'm not telling you, we're still trying to get the nuance right on this, but you tell them, you don't have to tell them, I'm hoping you'll go look at some good pornography. But I think you say instead, people look at these materials and I want you to think about what you're really looking at and what does it mean. It's not just throwaway. These are real people in there. There's also a film I suggest people watch with their teenagers. I'm friends with the producers, and it's called Sexy Baby. And it illustrates so well how significant pornography has become in the lives of teenagers and young adults. And one of the things, there's an adult film star that's in it, and she says people need to understand what we do because it looks good on camera. It's not that it's good sex, it's that it looks good on camera. And I think if you help kids, particularly teenage boys, don't really have a very good, kids with ADD especially, don't have a very good sense of the difference between the fantasy vision and what's real. And this shows up in their sexual practice, I guarantee you. I hear it from teenage girls all the time. And I could go into graphic detail, but trust me on it. Great question.
If your daughter doesn't want to talk about sex at all, this one parent asks, how do you go about it? She's 13 now, will be 14 this fall, but just won't listen when I start to talk about sex-related topics. Coupled with that, I just want to throw this in because I want to make sure you answer it. One parent asked, what if the kid is 13 or a 14-year-old boy? Is that old enough for informed consent? Actually, that's two different things. I'm sorry. How about the first one?
Yeah, those are separate, and they're both important questions. Okay, so what you want to do is, first of all, and I always hate to say this because then it leaves people who haven't done it out in the cold, but try to start conversations about relationships when kids are young. And if you want to do perfect best practices, don't say things like, someday when you have a girlfriend, you and she will have such fun together. Usually say a dating partner. That does allow it to be what's called less heteronormative. So then the kids aren't thinking, okay, I'm supposed to date a girl. That's true, by the way, for if you are gay and you're wanting to be very supportive of your child being gay. You don't say, well, when you have a same-sex partner someday, you two can get married now in most states. You're just let them figure that out. So you're talking about relationships. You say, well, I have really enjoyed being married to your dad or whatever, and we enjoy going on dates and having fun together. I wonder what you'll like to do someday when you go out with a dating partner. Just talk about those kind of things when kids are young. My son and I were at a science museum one time, and he turns to me and he says, he's like 7 at the time. He goes, "This is the best science museum ever." And I said, "Yeah, it is." He goes, "Look, I would like to have a girlfriend who would come here with me." And he looked around, and throughout the museum, I realized all these dating couples were there at this science museum. He had observed that. So we talked about how cool that would be to have a dating partner who would go to a science museum with you. So look for those opportunities. At 13, you kind of do the same thing without being pushy. And try to talk about other people's relationships. You know, is Susan dating anybody now? Or are kids dating a lot in your classroom? Things like that. Sort of work your way into it. Now, at 13, the clock is running on the actual sexual conduct. And so I think what your best bet is to just always point out, by talking in a healthy way about sex, I am a resource for you. You can also overtly say, if you don't feel like I'm a good resource for you, if you don't feel comfortable about that, we will find you an adult to talk to. All you have to do is say the word, and that'll work. I have been amazed in my career how many parents would just rather I did that for them. And I will gladly do it and help the kid and the parent, but I've been surprised how many people find that a lot easier. So there's a few options at the late age of 13. I think the second question was whether a 14-year-old boy is of age to consent. Is that the right question,
Right.
Wayne?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, the answer is this is a legal question. And in some states, that falls under what's called the Romeo and Juliet statute. In other states, it does not. And the Romeo and Juliet statute has to do with the age of the partner of the individual who is having sex. In most states, 14 is actually below that level, but you actually want to know in your state and teach your child what is the age of legal consent. There are other things people don't know about consent. For example, digitally inserting a finger into the vagina is considered rape in many states. And so if you're under the age of consent, something that is actually a very common behavior amongst teenagers in that age group could be charged as a sex offense if you're not aware. So again, learning about that, not in a scary way. If you sit your kid down and say, "Don't touch her or you're going to get a sex offense," probably that's not very likely. But to say, this is the legal statutes, this is what you have to be cautious about, and learn how that changes. In most states, the age of consent is 16. In some states, it is not. You want to know that. But 14 is rarely legally consent. Now, I bet you can guess how many teenagers that stops. So you still have reality, but it's important to also communicate with them.
Wes, are you there?
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. We just had a little audio problem. I think actually we've run out of time for more questions. We're approaching 2 o'clock here. I don't know, for me it was fabulous. I really appreciate all the insights you provided. I'm sure it helped a lot of folks who were on the webinar.
It was good to be here and discuss it. I'm always happy to have that conversation.
Great. So have a good day, Wes, and for everyone else, we'll see you next week at Attitude's next webinar with Ned Hallowell. Have a good